Chapter 3: The Spreading Darkness. 1 week after the Atlantic event, the blackout's reach extended deeper into the continental United States. Chicago went dark on a Wednesday afternoon, its skyscrapers becoming black monoliths against the setting sun. The power failures now reached hundreds of miles inland, defying all logical explanations. In Europe, the situation was equally dire. The blackout had engulfed most of Western Europe, reaching as far as Berlin. The United Kingdom was almost entirely without conventional power, save for isolated pockets in the Scottish Highlands, where steam-powered generators maintained minimal functionality. Prime Minister Tennant had relocated his government to Edinburgh. The ancient castle transformed into a command center, lit by gas lamps and mechanical generators. Reports from across the British Isles painted a grim picture. Food shortages, medical crises, and increasing civil unrest.
The Chinese assistance teams have expanded their presence,
reported the Home Secretary.
They've established what they're calling humanitarian zones in Liverpool, Bristol, and Southampton. In practice, these zones operate under their authority, not ours.
Do we have a choice?
Tennant asked wearily.
They have functional equipment, medical supplies.
At what cost, Prime Minister? They're mapping our infrastructure, positioning themselves for the recovery phase, assuming there is one.
In Moscow, President Kokolov faced a similar dilemma. The blackout had reached the city itself, rendering the Kremlin dependent on hastily installed steam generators. Russian military forces, initially deployed westward for humanitarian assistance, now served a more practical purpose, maintaining order in Russian cities plunged into darkness. China, meanwhile, had emerged as the unlikely beneficiary of the crisis. With its major population centers unaffected by the blackout, it positioned itself as the world's savior. Chinese ships delivered supplies to affected regions across Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Each delivery came with technical teams, security forces, and diplomatic staff, extending Beijing's influence under the guise of humanitarian aid.
The Americans are proposing a joint response,
reported Foreign Minister Liu to President Chen.
They're suggesting a coordination center in Iceland, powered by geothermal energy unaffected by the blackout.
Chen considered this.
Accept the invitation, but insist on equal leadership roles. Make it clear that any solution must include Chinese participation at every level.
In Washington, the steam-powered generators continued to churn out electricity, their black smoke creating an apocalyptic haze over the Capitol. The AERT had established a headquarters in the Pentagon, where walls were covered with maps tracking the blackout's spread.
It's advancing approximately 50 miles per day,
explained General Hayes, tracing a line across the map.
At this rate, it will reach the Mississippi River within 2 weeks.
What about Europe? Africa?
asked the president.
Similar patterns. The blackout is spreading inland from all Atlantic coasts at roughly the same rate. Russia reports Moscow is now affected. Africa's western coast is completely dark from Morocco to South Africa.
And our allies?
The situation in Europe is deteriorating rapidly.
The Secretary of State replied.
The UK government has relocated to Edinburgh. NATO command structures are fragmenting without reliable communications. And frankly, sir, China is filling the vacuum. Their humanitarian assistance is effectively giving them control over key areas in Western Europe.
What about the Russians?
President Kokolov has gone dark, literally and figuratively. Our limited intelligence suggests he's preparing for a potential conflict. Russian forces are mobilizing under the pretense of emergency response.
Trumsky nodded grimly.
So while we're chasing ghosts, our adversaries are positioning themselves for the aftermath.
The Cyber Response Division had reached a dead end. The arrested hackers provided no useful intelligence, and the mysterious code continued to evolve beyond their understanding.
Sir,
Dr. Patel addressed the president.
I believe we need to consider alternative explanations. This doesn't fit the profile of a cyber attack or an EMP. The progressive nature of the blackout, the adaptive code, these suggest something fundamentally different.
Like what?
The president asked. Before Dr. Patel could answer, a Coast Guard officer entered the room and whispered something to General Hayes. The general's expression darkened.
Mr. President, we've just received a report from a marine biologist in Maine, a Dr. Sandy Reeves. She claims to have found, well, sir, it sounds fantastic, but she claims to have found evidence that marine organisms are undergoing rapid evolutionary changes. And she's identified microorganisms that may be responsible.
What does this have to do with our power grid?
The president asked impatiently.
She believes these microorganisms may be affecting electronic systems as well as biological ones. She's requesting immediate support to continue her research.
The president scoffed.
We're facing the greatest national security crisis in history, and you want me to divert resources to examine fish?
Sir,
Interjected Dr. Chen.
perhaps we should consider all possibilities. Our conventional explanations have led nowhere.
After heated debate, the president reluctantly authorized a small team to investigate Dr. Reeves's claims. The team included Dr. Marcus Thompson from Space Force, Dr. Gabriela Rodriguez from NOAA, and Commander James Wilson from the Coast Guard.
Keep this quiet.
Trumsky instructed them.
The last thing we need is for Moscow or Beijing to learn we're investigating sea creatures while they're positioning assets.
What if this is connected to their activities?
Asked the Secretary of State.
The Chinese have been investing heavily in deep-sea research in the Atlantic, and the Russians have underwater installations we know little about.
All the more reason for discretion.
The president replied.
If either of them are behind this somehow, I don't want to show our hand.
Unknown to the Americans, similar investigations were already underway elsewhere. In Britain, marine biologists at the University of Edinburgh had noted abnormal behavior in North Sea fish species. Using equipment powered by Scotland's remaining functional wind turbines, they documented physiological changes remarkably similar to what Sandy was discovering in Maine. Russian scientists at a military research facility near Murmansk had made even more significant progress. With access to deep-sea specimens collected by their still-functional submarine fleet, they had identified the microorganisms and recognized their technological characteristics.
They are like miniature machines,
reported Dr. Andrei Petrov to President Kokolov.
but they grow and divide like living cells. Nothing in our biological weapons program resembles these organisms.
Kokolov, ever suspicious, saw opportunity rather than mystery.
Can they be weaponized, controlled?
Unknown, Mr. President. We need more time, more specimens.
In China, President Chen received similar reports from scientific advisors. Chinese research vessels in the South Pacific had collected water samples containing identical microorganisms. Unlike their Russian counterparts, Chinese scientists focused on the electromagnetic properties of the organisms rather than their potential as weapons.
They generate fields that disrupt electronic systems,
explained Dr. Zhang, the lead researcher.
We believe they may be responsible for the blackouts affecting other nations.
And China remains unaffected because...
Chen prompted.
Geography, Madam President. Our major population centers face the Pacific, not the Atlantic, but our models suggest the organisms are spreading. It may be only a matter of time.
The American team arrived at Sandy's laboratory 2 days later, expecting to find an eccentric scientist with implausible theories. Instead, they found a methodical researcher with disturbing evidence. Secretly, the president stood in a back corner of the room just to listen.
These organisms,
Sandy explained, displaying slides under her microscope,
appear to be technological in design, but biological in function. They're integrating with host tissues and rewriting DNA.
And you believe they're connected to the blackout?
asked Dr. Thompson skeptically. Sandy nodded.
They emit an electromagnetic field unlike anything I've recorded before. It disrupts conventional electronics. And they're everywhere, in the water, in marine life, possibly in the air we breathe.
That's a significant leap, Doctor. Reeves?
Said Commander Wilson.
Then explain this,
Sandy replied, leading them to a large tank. Inside swam what appeared to be a deep-sea anglerfish, except it had no business surviving in the shallow tank. More disturbing still, its gills were shrunken, and primitive lung-like structures had developed along its sides.
It's breathing air,
gasped Dr. Rodriguez.
That's impossible.
Not impossible,
Sandy corrected.
Just unprecedented. And it gets worse.
She showed them her latest findings. The same microorganisms had been identified in samples from patients suffering from the mysterious respiratory illness spreading through coastal communities.
They're not sick in the conventional sense,
Sandy explained.
Their bodies are being transformed, just like these fish.
While briefing the AERT, Sandy found an audience ready to believe even the most fantastic explanations.
The microorganisms appear to be terraforming agents,
she explained to the stunned officials.
They're transforming marine life to survive on land and transforming humans to survive in water.
That's insane,
whispered someone in the back of the room. It was the president.
Nevertheless, it's happening,
Sandy replied.
And based on tissue samples, I believe this process has been underway for decades, perhaps 50 years or more. It's only now reaching a tipping point.
Why?
Shouted the president, stepping out into the light.
What's the purpose?
I can't answer that without more data,
Sandy admitted.
But I believe the source is somewhere in the Atlantic. The epicenter of the transformations corresponds with the initial blackout zone.
After heated debate, the president authorized an expedition to the mid-Atlantic. A team of scientists, including Sandy, would travel on a retrofitted naval vessel, powered by steam engines, to investigate the source of the microorganisms. As the team prepared for departure, reports came in of the first violence. In coastal cities, transformed humans attacked those still unaffected. Meanwhile, strange creatures emerged from the ocean. Fish with limb-like appendages, crustaceans the size of dogs walking on adaptable claws, cephalopods using their tentacles to drag themselves across beaches. The world was changing, and humanity was unprepared for what was coming.